Hello, so I'm going to be reading to you guys the book Heart and Soul, the story of America and African Americans by Kidder Nelson. He's the author-illustrator. He's also the illustrator for Henry's Freedom Box. We're going to start at chapter 1, and chapter 1 is titled Declarations of Independence. And each chapter starts with a quote. So this chapter is by a quote from George Washington. It says, "Liberty, when it begins to take root, is a plant of rapid growth." So another word for liberty is freedom. So that's a metaphor. Freedom or liberty is a plant of rapid growth. Okay, the first picture here, if you can see it, it's called the Baptism of Pocahontas. We learned about Pocahontas in history class, Jamestown, Virginia. And down there you have an African-American gentleman viewing the painting. Okay, I don't have my glasses on because of the glare, so I'm going to try my best. It says, "Ever visit the Capitol in Washington, D.C.? It's a beautiful white building made of sandstone and has a big iron dome that rises over the city like a full moon. It was built by slaves and freedmen to be a symbol of liberty the Americans had won from England in the American Revolution." We haven't quite got that far in history class yet, but we're getting there. "Inside the rotunda there are large paintings and sculptures of famous Americans, big old statues of Abraham Lincoln and George Washington. The paintings tell the story of how America came to be. Strange, though. Nary a black face in any of those pretty pictures. There's plenty of white folks and a few Indians here and there, but none of us. As if we never existed, stricken from the record like Moses from the walls of Egypt. Of course, those fancy paintings ain't telling the whole truth. Black folks have been here as long as Europeans. By the early 1600s, English, Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch, and French settlers had made their way to America and established colonies along the East Coast. The colonies were a means for European countries to expand their empires and were also a new source of wealth. Each colony produced crops and mined for riches that were sent back to Europe. Africans had come to America as laborers with the Spanish in Florida in 1565, and about 60 years later with the English in Virginia to do the work of building the colonies and producing what was sent back to Europe. The labor of these Africans helped to create the foundation of America in its early days. So you see, we deserve to be in those pretty pictures just as much as the Europeans and Indians. And if you really want to know the truth, honey, we are as much of a reason that they would later have a chance to fight for their liberty in the first place." By the mid-1700s, I gotta show you a picture. I think you can kind of see it. I love his paintings. It's beautiful. Anyway. By the mid-1700s, the English colonists had been in America for a few generations. They had gained control of most of the settled land along the eastern seaboard, set up local governments, and made the colonies quite profitable by way of slave-produced crops. So those are the things that we've been learning about. We were learning about the southern colonies. Tobacco, rice, indigo, all of those things that they would grow on the plantations. Having been in America for so long, many of the colonists began to think of themselves as Americans rather than British, and had grown good and tired of living under the thumb of a faraway king. The colonists felt it was time they had a say about how they ran their local governments. They began to talk on the streets, over dinner tables, and in taverns about the king's unfair taxes, about his nosy soldiers everywhere, and about splitting from England. They talked about not wanting to be slaves to the king. Slaves, child? Where in the world could they ever know about that? The king had taxed the colonists for everything from paint to glass to paper. He even taxed their tea. People in the colonies had finally had enough. To show the king what they thought of his taxes, they snuck out onto his boats and dumped all of his tea into the harbor. It wasn't long before the king sent more troops over here to try to put the folks in the colonies back in their place. But it only made relations worse. In 2 years, there was blood on the streets of Boston, and in one more, Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence to cut ties with England. The American Revolution had begun. So, the Declaration of Independence that they're talking about is a document written by Thomas Jefferson in 1776, and that is considered the birthday of America because in it he said, the reasons that they wanted to be free of the King of England and the rights that they should have. And so the famous quote that you hear is "Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Those are the rights that Thomas Jefferson said everybody should have in the Declaration of Independence. However, when he wrote the Declaration of Independence, there were slaves all over the colonies, and he was a slaveholder himself with a large plantation with many slaves on it. And so he was saying that they should have liberty or freedom at the same time that they had people who were living as slaves. Interesting. Okay. There were slaves who fought in that war, but unfortunately, many of them chose the wrong side. By the time of the Revolutionary War, there were more than 450,000 black folks, both slave and free, living in the colonies. The British had promised freedom to any slave who fought for them. And honey, that was a powerful thing to tell a slave. So thousands of them joined the British. Okay, because remember, the American Revolution, the colonists are fighting against the British, against England. Okay, they don't want to be owned by them anymore. Because remember, the colonies are technically part of Great Britain. Okay, so they're fighting against the King of England. But according to this, the slaves fought for the British because the British said that they would give them their freedom. The British had promised freedom to any slave who fought for them. And honey, that was a powerful thing to tell a slave. So thousands of them joined the British. General George Washington, who was in charge of the American troops, didn't allow black folks in his army. He and Congress didn't think it was a good idea to put guns in the hands of folks who might well use them against their former masters or other white folks. So they were afraid of giving guns to them because, honestly, they knew that they weren't really fair to them. They'd been treating them as slaves, so they figured if we give them guns, they might fight against us instead. Okay. This, by the way, is one of my favorite pictures in the book because it looks just, but if you look closely, what you see hidden there, okay, you can see the African-American man in the front, and the guy on the horse, if he doesn't look familiar, is George Washington, who will become your first president. And the man down here would be his personal valet or his personal slave. His name was Billy Lee. And Billy Lee went everywhere with George Washington. It was considered to be almost like a friend of George Washington. However, he was still his slave. They would ride horses together. They would go everywhere together. But the way that he kind of shows him almost hidden in the background is kind of the way you can think about their relationship. So Washington and others didn't want to give the Africans guns, but it says here, okay, so but Washington changed his mind after he had lost so many of his soldiers to the fighting and the smallpox. Only then were free black folks and some of the slaves allowed to join the army. General Washington was quickly rewarded by all the black men who signed up to help him gain the upper hand. So if you gain the upper hand, you're doing better than the other side. After 8 years of war, America won its freedom from England, and its citizens were able to manage their own affairs and control their property without having to pay the crown for the privilege. So that big fancy sentence means that the Americans won, they were no longer part of England, and the king couldn't tax them. They had the right now to make their own government. Oh, so it says they could control their property, okay? So now the book says, oh, did I mention that their property included us? Both the slaves and free black folks who fought in this war for freedom hoped the government might set all the slaves in the colony free if they fought for them. But the government only freed the people who fought in the army and the slaves who lived in the New England states like Massachusetts that chose to abolish slavery after the war. So abolish means to get rid of. Just about everyone else was out of luck, especially many of the slaves who fought for the British. Some left with the British or fled to Canada, but most went right back into slavery. So a lot of those slaves who made the choice to fight with the British because the British was offering them freedom, when it was time for the British to leave and their troops to have to leave America because they lost, so they had to go back to England, they brought some of the loyalists with them, people who did not fight against the king, and they left many many of the slaves who fought for them behind. And then those slaves, instead of getting the freedom they were promised, a lot of them ended right back up on the plantations or another plantation. A few years later, America wrote her founding papers, the Constitution. George Washington was made the very first president and a new country was born. It should have been a proud moment for everybody, but honey, we didn't have much reason to celebrate. Though the fruits of our labor and our volunteer soldiers, we had helped free America from England. And yet we were stuck in a country that kept most of us as slaves. That is the end of chapter 1.